My name is Leona Egeland Rice. I threw my things down and I said, "What's happening?" And they said, "Well, there's a snake. He wants to know what we're going to do with our children when we go to work." Well, we put them in the closet. I think that's what pot smells like. And I got caught with the no. And I didn't squeal on them. There are issues that can be influenced from the bully pulpit. My name is Leona Egeland Rice, and in 1974, Leona Egeland was elected as the 15th woman to the state legislature. In 1970, there was a new census taken, and there was my home in the middle of a new district with no incumbent. And so I had a great deal of encouragement from the women that I had served with and played with and worked with in the county in all sorts of environmental causes, and AAUW and the League of Women Voters and the Environmental Commission, and they were all very happy to volunteer and work on a women's campaign. And so this was a brand new kind of campaign, and with a few exceptions of some very brave men who decided they could be together with all these pushy women, most of my workers were women. The 24th Assembly District was then different in 1974 than it is today. The lines have changed, but basically it covered rural San Benito County and Hollister, San Juan Bautista, Aromas, Tres Peños, and then it had the southern part of Santa Clara County, Gilroy, Morgan Hill, Coyote, which is no longer there, and the southern part of San Jose, and including that area of San Jose that was Almaden, Edenvale, Oak Grove, Evergreen, and a portion of where the college is. Now, I ran for office in high school, and I was the student body treasurer, and I had been very, very active for many years as a teenager in a group called B'nai B'rith Girls. And from the time I was 13 to the time I was 17, I held many elected offices in that organization, and I kind of cut my teeth with that, because I learned about how you cope with multiple situations at the same time, and volunteers, and how you organize. And so I really felt that a lot of what I had to do later in life, not just in the legislature but in life, I did learn from the organizations and my high school experience. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and I was one of two children, both of us being an only child at the same time, because my sister was 10 years older than me. So she was just like all the other grown-ups in the world until I got to be much older, and then the years between us melted away. My parents moved from New York to Arizona, and I was 5. And so I don't remember anything but Tucson. My mother had arthritis. She was a quiet woman. She didn't work. She spent a lot of time resting, and her activities were sewing. My father was a plastering contractor and came home every day with plaster on his mustache, and pretty rough-looking man. And he went to bed very early, because in Arizona you started to work outside at 5 in the morning if you could. So that was his schedule. I spent a lot of time at the library. I read all the books in the children's library. I developed my desire to travel, which I've done all the rest of my adult life by reading all the books about other places in the world. And I was a pretty good student, but I was, I think that there were some people that helped me to, at a very early age, to be very interested in charity work or to do something for other people. My parents wrote checks, and I used to watch them send off checks to organizations, but there was a lady across the street that worked at the Red Cross, and she taught me how to make what they called disposable bags. This was before plastic bags, remember? And so you could take a newspaper and fold it up in a certain way, and it made a bag, and then the Red Cross people that went to someone's home would pin it on the bed and put all the little gungy stuff that, you know, the waste, and then they could fold it over and throw it away. And so that's how they did it at those years. And I used to sit and listen to my radio programs, children's radio programs, and I would sit and fold, and I would collect newspapers from all over the rest of the neighbors, so we had plenty of newspapers, and I would bring this lady all the newspapers, and I started doing that when I was in the 3rd grade and did it for a long time. After I graduated from the University of Arizona, I taught for 1 year and decided then I would go for a master's degree. Then I became a Californian, and I went to San Jose State University to get my master's degree in science education. And then I taught for several years after that, after I got my master's degree. And then I stopped teaching and had a family. I did get married in between then, and I had 2 daughters. And during that time, I taught part-time. But when I wanted to get a job, getting a full-time teaching position, I was too expensive. I had a master's degree, I had several years of experience, and the school districts were really hurting for money, and they could hire 2 people for my salary. So I had a very hard time getting a job, and so I was offered a very unusual job by Zero Population Growth and Planned Parenthood, and they had never had a lobbyist, and there were things they wanted done in the legislature, and even just a few resolutions, something to bring to light and have the press talk about population growth, and more controversial issues like family planning and abortion rights and contraceptives to minors and things of that sort. So I was giving a speech for Earth Day in San Jose, and I was approached by people from those 2 groups asking if I would be very interested in having that kind of a job. Well, I needed a job. I didn't know anything about lobbying, but I figured I'm a quick study, I'll learn. And so I took that job. And it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. I went to Sacramento and talked to men about sex, and I got paid to do that. So it was so much fun, and most of the gentlemen that I talked to, they didn't quite know what to do about this, that I was just, it was a time that this was 1971, 72, they didn't know, they didn't want to talk about things like that, especially with a young woman, and but I was very serious about what I was about. Senator Tony Bielenson was my mentor. He always says he carried my sex legislation, and so he carried the bills on contraceptives to minors to create the Office of Family Planning and the Therapeutic Abortion Act. Before I was in the legislature, I was a science teacher. I had a major in biology from the University of Arizona, and I taught general science and biology in both junior high and high schools. And I did that. I taught for 7 years. When I did decide to run, I walked in every walkable precinct for about a year and a half before the election. And I was a hiker, so I loved walking, and I would get out of that campaign office and get my packet of stuff and start knocking on doors. And I had precinct captains who, you only in the primary, you went to your party, the doors, those were registered Democrats, and they were people who voted in the last 5 elections, so you didn't want to waste all your time with somebody who never voted, even though they were registered. And you had little notes where you left, "I'm sorry I missed you," and all of that. But walking precincts was really, really fun. And I had a few adventures I would just like to relate. I was in Gilroy. I was walking past one of the houses because that was a Republican that lived in that house that voted. And all of a sudden I heard all these screams, and the kids were obviously having a party, but they were yelling, "Catch it, catch it, catch it." So I threw my things down and I said, "What's happening?" And they said, "Well, there's a snake. There's a snake." I said, "Well, get me a gunny bag, a gunny sack." And so they ran and got a sack for me, and I reached in and I grabbed the snake and I pulled it out. I said, "Remember, I was a science teacher." So, and so the father came running up to me. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Oh, here's my brochure." I said, "I'm running for the state legislature." I said, I'm a Democrat, and you can't vote for me in the primary, but you can vote for me in the general." He said, "Oh, good." I said, "Which would you like, the sack or my brochure?" He said, "I'll take both." And they became part of my Republicans for Egeland committee in the general election. I had one house, the woman said, "Oh, I know you. Your campaign headquarters is right next to the library." I said, "Yes, that's right." I was happy she recognized me. She says, "Would you mind returning my children's books?" And they were all late, so I had to pay their fine. But maybe one of the funniest stories, because this was picked up and also on AP Wire, because I gave this story in some town hall meeting in San Jose, and Harry Farrell, who was the political editor of the San Jose Mercury at the time, thought this was great. So he wrote it up, and then it went haywire. So I knocked at one door, and the man opened it, and there was a very strange odor coming out, and I knew, I think that's what pot smells like. And he was having a pot party, seemed to be alone, and he was stark naked. And so I looked in his eyes and I said, "Here's my literature. I'm Leona Egeland, and I'm running for the state assembly, and I have a phone number right here if you have any questions that you would like to ask me after I leave here. Why, just call that number, and I hope you'll vote for me." And I said, "And by the way, my husband has a suit just like that at home." And he says, "I'm voting for you, lady." In 1974, when I ran, there were 8 opponents in my primary. So it was a very busy time with lots and lots of campaign signs and brochures, and everybody very busy. I was not the favored candidate of the Central Committee, the Democratic Central Committee in my county, and but one of the things that they hadn't counted on was the ripple effect of Watergate. And Watergate happened in 1972, and I was running, it was early 73, and I looked the least like Richard Nixon. And I wasn't an incumbent, I wasn't an attorney, I wasn't a male, and so I didn't look like anybody that was in office. And that was something that was a phenomenon across the United States, and it's important for people, maybe somebody will write a book about this, but the ripple effect of Watergate was that many women, I believe, were elected to state and national office after that, because women began voting for women. And up until that point, many women asked their husbands, who do you think I should vote for? Or their fathers, or their brothers. Because men were interested in politics, and women, it wasn't a very ladylike kind of a thing, so they didn't really get into politics. And women were on school boards, and women were on city councils, and women were on water districts, but they weren't in state legislatures, and they weren't in Congress. And after the women across the country had asked the men in their life who to vote for, and they had said, vote for Richard Nixon. And now they said, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to vote for who I want. And in my case, I was very fortunate because the women would say, and I know her. I worked with her in AAUW and the League and environmental things and in other campaigns, and I know her and I trust her, and she's honest. And so I don't care what you tell me, I'm voting the way I want. And I think that was a phenomenon to be looked at across the whole country in the 1974 election, 1976 elections. But I always say that I was elected by Republican women because the Democratic women, I was the Democratic candidate in the general, but the Republican women crossed over and voted for me in great numbers. And I had been part of their world in all of these organizations in San Jose. So I was the recipient of some very good Watergate ripple effect. Pauline Davis was the lone female in the legislature of 120 people when I was elected. And in previous years, Yvonne Brathwaite Burke was there, but she went on that year to Congress, and March Fong Yu was there, and she became Secretary of State. So only Pauline was there, and when I was elected in 1974, both Pauline and I think a lot of the members of the legislature, they just kind of ignored me. They didn't quite know how to relate to a younger feminist. I was the feminist. In fact, I had support from women all over the state of California. And I talked about issues that were of interest to them, and they were very, very supportive. So when I was elected, my colleagues, with a few exceptions like Gary Hart and others, but they really didn't know how to relate to me, and so they avoided relating to me. I was purposefully left out of certain meetings, parties. I didn't go play cards all night at Fats. I didn't go on, wasn't invited to go on a number of trips, and there were some people who were downright mean. My staff would cut their pictures out and put them in the middle of a bullseye on a target on the back of my office door so we could throw darts at them because they were particularly mean. And one of the things then, when my first bill went through the Assembly and then went over on the Senate side, I remember going over to the Senate side. There were no women in the Senate at that time, ever. And so I was signing in, as we do, to hear our bills. And this huge man who was the sergeant at arms looked down at me and he said, on the Senate side, we don't let staff sign in for the members. And so I gave him my card. And I said, I'll be happy to tell my staff never to sign in for me. But there was, who was this interloper? Who was this person that they didn't know what I was capable of doing, they didn't know what my interests were, and really had a very difficult time relating. But one of the stories I would like to share is that I was not in the legislature more than a few weeks when there was a big fight for the speakership. And Willie Brown was challenging Leo McCarthy. And it was a huge fight. And when I was running, there were only 2 legislators that helped me in my primary. And one was Bill Lockyer and one was Willie Brown. And so I didn't know a Leo McCarthy from the Man in the Moon at that time, but I knew Willie, and so of course I was going to vote for Willie. So I did, and Leo won. And by the way, he wasn't Leo McCarthy then. He was either Mr. McCarthy or Speaker McCarthy. We didn't use first names, only last names at that time. So I was not Leona, I was Egeland. And so after Willie lost the election, I lost my office. And I was my new office was assigned up on the 6th floor. And it was a tiny little office. In fact, it had been staffed to John Vasconcellos. They had one of his committees had staff up there. It was so tiny that my 2 secretaries had to give signals to each other so that one didn't squash the other one behind the door if the file drawer was open or something. It was very, very tiny, and we were not going to function that way forever. So I had to think of a way to get back down off the 6th floor, which was sort of where people were relegated when the speaker didn't want them. And so I called for a statewide meeting of women leaders. And I invited the state president of the League of Women Voters, the state president of the AAUW, the state president of the PTA, the state president of all of the women's groups, the business groups, various associations. And after all, yes, Pauline had been there, but she wasn't particularly interested in women's issues. And what I said is, can we meet? And I am your person now here, and I want to hear from you what you think are some of the most important things that I should introduce legislation about. And they all said they would come. And then I invited Mr. Speaker. And I said, I'm having a meeting on such and such a date, and I have all of these are the women who are coming, all these state presidents. There'll be some press there, and I would like you to come and welcome them. And he says, where's the meeting? I said, in my office. And you know, the next day my office was now located on the 4th floor, and I had a very big office. And I had that office all through the 3 terms. The biggest surprise for me, perhaps starting with my campaign, but even after I was elected, was that I had no party support. They didn't support women. They didn't support young people. They didn't support minorities. And my party didn't support me. Not even when I won the primary, they said, that's a lost district. So I never got any support officially from the party. And so when I was elected, I owed them nothing. And when I would get a call, would you please, consider speaking, would you, I didn't feel any obligation, as I think people often do when they're heavily supported by the party. So I could take their considerations and the party platform and pick and choose what I wanted to do. But that was a big surprise. I always thought, as an outsider to politics, that the party would always support whoever won the election. They didn't. Well, when I was elected, like many other members, ideas are brought to you often by various departments of government. So there were people in the Brown administration, there were people who were in the Department of Health, there were people from social services, and they would bring ideas for legislation. So you could say, yes, I want that, yet no, I don't want that. But I had a lot of people from the departments bringing me things to bring up. I came with my own ideas of some things that I wanted to do, such as change the budget so we had more money going to children's services and mental health in the counties, and certainly to further the causes of family planning programs and availability of family planning devices for those who wish them. And I, as a teacher and a former instructor in family life education programs, it was appalling to me that there was so much opposition and so much vehemence against sex education. So we changed it to euphemistically call it family life education. But after all, this is why we're all here. This is what we are. This is how we function. This is what we do. And it just seems so impossible to me that that wouldn't be part of our instruction for children, just like how your muscles work and how your skeletal system works, and the reproductive system needs to be taught too. So, but there was a lot of opposition to teaching. This is a compilation of all the bills I carried for one term. I have 3 of these books, and this was before computers. So this is how you went to the bill room and you got a copy of the piece of legislation. And you had to have a hard copy, and lobbyists stood in line at the bill room, and members stood in line at the bill room, and staff stood in line at the bill room. And but this is what it said, and you would have. So I have a copy of every bill I've introduced. Obviously, all of them didn't pass, but it's fun to reminisce as you go through all of these. And one of the each bill, it would have who introduced it, and then it would have who co-authored it, because you needed a co-author on the in the other house. So often the co-author was someone who was your senator or near to your assembly district, or someone that really followed that kind of legislation and was very interested. And if you could get a co-author that was of the other party, that was assured your bill had a better chance of passing. And one of the things I might mention is that during my first term, this bill, this is a copy of the bill, it was dated April 23rd, 1975. And it was the last bill that said introduced by Assemblyman Egeland. And I said, no, I've got to go down to the printing office and see if they'll put in Assemblywoman Egeland. And so for my bills, they started having to do put the type in, I guess manually, because for everybody else was still an assemblyman and I was an assemblywoman. And later that year, when Teresa Hughes was elected in a special election, she wanted to be an assemblywoman too. And one day, Pauline Davis came storming into my office. I am an assemblyman. I am not an assemblywoman. And I said, well, you can be an assemblyman. She says, it's a generic term. I said, she likes senator. I said, no, it says man. Mine says woman. If you want to be an assemblyman, let the printing office know that. So the printing office she was an assemblyman, Teresa and I were assemblywoman, and everybody else was assemblyman. And that's the reason all members now are called assembly members. They just did it that way. There are issues that can be influenced from the bully pulpit when you have an opportunity to speak out about them. So some of the things that happen and changes that happen are not just legislation. And I know that in 1975, women could still not get credit cards in their own name. And when I applied for my credit card from the Bank of America, that was my bank. And I was the assembly member, right? And I I was earning money. I had all of the criteria, of earning the money and having all the credit, everything. And they said I could have a credit card, but it would say Mrs. Gil Egeland. And I said, no. I want it to say Leona Egeland. And I couldn't get one. So I called a press conference. And I invited members of the press from all over the state. And then I called up my banker, who happened to also be very active in the state Democratic Party. And I invited him and I said, you could come and explain why, with the same income and the same credit, and that a woman can't get a credit card. Or you can be the first bank in California to announce that you're going to give credit cards to women who qualify in their own names. And so that's what he did. And I don't know if the B of A was the only bank that did, but it was certainly one of the first. I came to the legislature with a great passion for reproductive rights and decisions by both men and women about their own reproductive rights. So I looked for many opportunities for expanding that, for education, for funding, but I also had I was very interested in expanding services for mental health for children. And one of the things that needed to be done was that the funds that went to the counties for mental health, there was no particular pocket just for children. There were the mental health services for the county, and children didn't vote. Other categories voted. So often children didn't get a big piece of the pie. And so I did focus on that in both legislation and in the budget. But my legislation was about many different things. I was in Mr. Koloff's 8th grade math class, and my friend Howard Goldstein was passing a note to Ray Hopkins, and I was sitting in the middle. And I got caught with the note. And I didn't squeal on them, but I got paddled in front of the whole class. And at that, I was so humiliated. Not only did it physically hurt, but I never forgot how bad that felt emotionally. And so fast forward many years later, here I am in a position to do something about corporal punishment. Banning corporal punishment had been attempted before, and as I looked at the possible votes among my colleagues, I didn't think that a total ban on corporal punishment was going to work either. So I introduced a bill that indicated that the schools that needed to have parental permission to paddle the student. Well, there were many conservative members in both parties in the houses, and they liked parental permission on a whole lot of things. So I was able to get votes for having schools. It wasn't a ban on corporal punishment. It was that they couldn't paddle the students without parental consent. Now, I had envisioned the schools calling the parents, and that I thought would be, they'd never do that. Instead, what the schools actually did after my bill passed was that they sent home notices in the beginning of the school year asking for parents to sign, your child can go to sex education classes, your child cannot go, your child can be paddled, your child cannot be paddled. But it gave the parents the opportunity to say, you know, he needs to be spanked, I'll spank him. I'm not going to have somebody I don't know spank my kid. They didn't realize that spanking was still taking place. This is the prop I used when I testified before the legislature. This was a real paddle used in a real school. And by the way, most of the students that were paddled at that time were boys, and they were in the middle school ages. And many of them were minorities. So it wasn't that paddling was across the board. But anyway, my bill passed with the help of legislators who wanted to make sure that parents knew. So I was very happy with that. The legislation that I carried, that I believe had the greatest impact, had to do with genetic testing of infants. You know, every piece of legislation that impacts a certain population group, of course, for that group, it's very, very important. But perhaps for society, I would think that if I look back over all of the legislation, it was that I expanded the genetic testing of infants, and there were many tests that were given up until that point for all the infants, but some of the more rare cases like phenylketonuria, PKU, and there were some others that were expensive tests, and they were rare conditions, but of course they were very severe if they were undetected. So I think that probably was the long-lasting greatest impact. There's always obstacles when you're running. Obviously, your opponents are going to bring up things that are half-truths, and you have obstacles that they bring up things that are about your personal life. So you have to be able to answer without getting angry, and answer questions asked of you in a rational way. Because people aren't listening to your answer, they're getting a feeling of what you're conveying to them. So if you come across as harsh and angry and vindictive, or too pushed back, too argumentative about the item that is being asked or brought up. So I think it has a lot to do with the way you respond to things. So when asked personal questions, what are you going to do with your children? What does your husband think of you running? How could you possibly understand the complexities of a budget for the state? All of those sorts of things, you have to be able to respond to questions like that. You can't just ignore them, but your response has to be with some humor and yet factual. So I found that the best way to answer some of those questions was to turn to the audience and ask the other women. He wants to know what we're going to do with our children when we go to work. Well, we put them in the closet. No, we don't. We get the best child care that we can, right, ladies? And they all, yes, you know. And so I said, that's what I'm going to do too. And, you know, he wants to know how we're going to possibly manage the budget. Really, ladies, who does the budget at your house? You know, who manages the money at your house? And so I tried to take some of those questions, which could be obstacles and make them into actual, we're together, aren't we, ladies? But the obstacles were fundraising, of course. Now, in those days, we didn't have to raise the gazillion dollars that you have to raise today. This was before computers. This was before computer-generated letters. This was before, we didn't do TV even. We just, it was too expensive. So we had radio ads and billboards, and we walked precincts. But money was an obstacle. And as I mentioned before, not having party support was probably an obstacle during the campaign. I probably, if I were doing it all over again, which I'm not, would give more talks to young women and encourage them to become part of the elected world and to join in with boards and commissions in their local districts and to experience it. That yes, you can do it. There's nothing that should prevent you from being elected to office. And I think that even today, while there are many more women in the state legislature, it doesn't represent the population.
How would you like to be remembered?
I guess as a pioneer.
Were you called a pioneer before?
Yes.
By who?
By the women that helped elect me. I was their pioneer. This was 2002. And I carried the torch for all of, I guess, 2 or 3 blocks. I ran in Oakland, and so this was the Salt Lake City Olympics. It was the Winter Olympics. And but anyway, I was a torch carrier, and so this is the official torch. You're allowed to buy your torch, and this is where they light it. So there's a gas thing. They put gas in it, and it lights, and then you light it from one person to the next runner to the next. So you just go and you wear your little outfit and you run, and it was really a lot of fun.